And so you have to be very careful, in my opinion, as how you measure success.
Yes.
Because, in fact, you're looking for the long-term longevity of the business you're investing in and creating.
Yes.
You're not actually, or you shouldn't operate it for the immediate term.
I'm sitting here today with an old friend, Dighé. Ian and I have known each other for 15 years, but for much longer than that, for more than 30 years, Ian has been in the investment banking business and financial services. And I think he just stood down as the chairman of Miton Group.
That's correct, friend.
And so in this part of the program, we've been studying the importance of the customer relationship. I think business gives lip service to this, but often their practice and their rhetoric do not line up. And
Sure.
I know from experience with you and the years that we've worked together that both, and really your reputation in the city, that you've placed high value on the way a customer is treated. And we have a diverse group of students. Some are senior, experienced leaders who are coming back for their postgraduate training, and others are young and fresh and just starting in the workforce. But I think all of them have in common an interest in what it looks like when you take some of the principles that we've been talking about and you apply them in a real situation. So I'm going to ask you a question. It's related to something we teach called the trust trial.
Sure.
And odd enough, Ian and I were in a meeting just yesterday with a group of bankers discussing the trust trial as we talked about a transaction. I don't think he knew at the time that we'd be in the studio today and having this conversation, but
I didn't.
But I refer back to it because I think it gives us a way to think about the topic.
Sure.
So the stages in the trust trial, I'll just recap them. The students know them, and you and I have discussed them in the past, are that a set of observations, these are the facts that we give to someone about ourselves. These facts infer, or we allow someone to infer from those observations a conclusion about us. The premise is that marketing should not make a claim, but rather it should foster a conclusion. And one of the ways we foster that conclusion is by controlling the set of observations that we present and presenting them in such a way that they cause a natural inference to the right conclusion. That conclusion powers what comes next in the thought sequence, which is a decision. And that decision is followed up with an expectation. So because of what I conclude about you, I might decide to do business with you. But with that decision is an expectation. And as Ian knows, what comes next is really the acid test of that process, because the expectation is then met by the experience. If the experience doesn't line up with the expectation, then the challenge is that this negative experience, this disappointment, becomes the new set of observations, and thus they conclude differently and they decide differently, and often we lose a customer, for instance. So in your own space in banking, and this, of course, applies, I would imagine, right down to the micro level of an individual investor or customer, and up to the large level where perhaps you're doing acquisitions or other things in your group. Let me just ask you this. How have you found, when you're meeting with someone in your field and you want them to make a favorable decision, how do you balance that process in the conversation where you're presenting things about yourself, but you don't want to be pretentious,
Sure.
you don't want to brag, and yet you need them to see a certain set of facts to draw a conclusion? How do you manage that process in your experience?
The way I would answer that, Flint, is that certainly in the areas that I've worked in, you tend to fall into the trap of thinking that you have to persuade somebody that you're competent. The irony of it is they wouldn't be sitting in front of you if they didn't have a fundamental belief that you could be competent.
Yes.
So in my sense, the first thing I want to do is to see if I can establish a credible, authentic relationship
Yes.
with this individual
Yes.
or this individual's organization. Often this individual will be a key director, a key decision maker. But really, he's just one of the stakeholders or representing the stakeholders. But he is a key individual who will have an influential decision.
Yes.
So I try not to persuade. The common fault is that you have your decks of information that you persuade by data.
Yes.
But actually, they already know who your competitors are, the alternative providers.
Yes.
Probably better than you, if they've done their job properly. So what they're looking to do to see if they can trust you, and you have to start that process at the very beginning. Find the commonality of interest, the authentic behaviors, and there's a number of things that you do so well here.
You told a story that I don't know if you can say it on camera or not. You might need to change or not share the name of the bank, although I think the name of the bank was quite remarkable. You were meeting with the governor of that bank.
Sure.
And you told about a young leader that was preparing and what you said and what happened. Can you relate any of that story with us? Because it's an excellent example of what we're talking about.
Yes, I ought to preserve the names of some of the individuals, but in the UK, we had some very credible banks before the banking crisis, and the particular bank that you're referring to, Flint, I had the opportunity of having a relationship with that bank that ironically went back at least 10 to 15 years before that meeting.
Yes.
So proven trust, proven experience, a proven understanding of how each other viewed life that led me to be in a very privileged position of seeking support for them for the foundation of my broking business called Bridgewell. And for those of you who will search, you'll be able to work out who this bank is. But this bank was run by some very, very credible individuals towards the end of their banking careers.
Yeah.
And as fate would have it, if you like, at the end of what was 200 or 300 years of extraordinary banking in Scotland. And we went up, my colleague and I, a very classically trained investment banker colleague, trusted colleague, with a deck of presentation about the space that we wanted our business to dominate.
Yeah.
And I said, well, we can try that, but actually they just want to sit down and talk to us.
Yes.
And we arrived in this wonderful building and went into the governor's hall and were met, and out came the deck.
Yeah.
At which point the senior banker said, and I won't try and copy the accent, but he suggested to my colleague that he perhaps spent some time with some of his colleagues pricing how this involvement would be, and he just sat
downstairs.
Downstairs.
Yes.
Well, I think it was in an ante-room, but effectively away from where these two individuals who ran this bank on behalf of the board just sat down and had a cup of tea.
Yes.
Now, the expectation was that we had to go and prove something, that we were worthy of this investment.
Yes.
From their point of view, they just wanted to talk about behavior.
Yeah.
How were we going to run this business?
Yeah.
What did we want to achieve with it? And how would we be doing things? How would we be talking to our customers? How would we be recruiting? Because we were starting with an empty room, a clean sheet of paper. And on the way back, as we got on the plane back, my colleague and friend said, well, I don't know quite what happened there, but we seem to have got the money. I said, we always had the money. We always had the money. We wouldn't have been invited up there if they didn't want to invest in our business. They just wanted to talk about how the relationship would work.
Yes.
And that was a defining moment for me in starting that business, and a salutary lesson and a reminder of how good business relationships start and are built upon.
Let me ask you this. I know that you've been involved in acquisition and divestiture, and that you have both, you've had some difficult waters to navigate. I know that you're put on boards when there's challenges and there's problems, because your name on the board brings confidence to the investors. I'm just being candid.
That's kind of
how do you set, in those complex situations, how do you get your compass to bring clarity? Because I know you've walked away from significant amounts of money in some of these transactions because it didn't seem like the best way to go forward. How do you sort through the natural self-interest that sometimes blinds us, Ian? How do you get past that and get to your compass?
That's not an easy question to answer in a generic sense. From a personal point of view, and it sounds like false modesty,
Yes.
but I found it's actually hard to do, is I put myself last. If you want the very best for your company, particularly where there are many stakeholders,
Yeah.
which is often the case in the companies I've been involved in, where they're public companies, lots of outside shareholders with often diametrically opposite objectives and historical reasons why they're there. I find that if I put the stakeholders in the business first,
Yes.
it seems to give me a more healthy terms of reference to start evaluating that some of the crucial decisions that I have to make. And that allows you to view people within the business differently and the situations on a more balanced basis, because the easy thing, especially if a company's got into financial trouble, is you are under pressure. There's an anxiousness. The business is suffering financially. There is a pressure to be expedient in your decision making.
Yes.
But just because the business is in financial trouble doesn't mean to say the underlying business is in trouble.
Yeah.
So we certainly in the UK, pre the crash and since, have got caught up in the whole thing of financial engineering, thinking that process
Yes.
will deliver the answer. Process clearly is important, but it will never deliver the answer in how to reimagine the survival of a business and, more importantly, the growth of a business. And the people in the business often are looking for fresh leadership
Yes.
and courage.
Yeah.
And they don't want perfect directors,
Yes.
but they want authentic directors. They want to be led in an authentic fashion. And to do that, you need to be able to stand back and view the business as a whole and act for the stakeholders in their best interest. And that really means that sometimes you have to put your own financial position last.
Yes.
And that then liberates all in the business. And sometimes you have to make very hard decisions about people, and that affords you the opportunity for them to leave well and finish well.
Yeah.
And it empowers them to have great careers outside of the business they've been lost in
Yes.
or disappointed in.
Yes.
And it's a critical thing. You can't have people leaving a business or being restructured in a business, leaving in a broken and disappointed way. Of course, they're going to be disappointed in one sense, but not disappointed about their own abilities to flourish elsewhere.
You described putting yourself last, and we often talk inside of our work here about a principle, customer first. It's a view about how one should approach business. How would you relate what you just said about putting the customer first? I'm aware that your stakeholders are often your primary customers in a business like that, but in your own experience...
Well, yes, they are, and yes, they're not.
Yes.
In the sense that, I suppose certainly in the last business, the Miton Group, clearly our customers ultimately were those who bought or invested in the various funds that we launched. But it's a very interesting thing that they probably have hundreds of alternative funds
Yes.
that they could invest in. Some of them with comparable performance. I'd hate to say some with a few better performance.
Yeah.
So why would they invest with the Miton Group? And we found over a period of time that was not just the competence of the fund manager, who had a critical role to play, but over an increasing level of intensity, I suppose, we found that the wealth managers managing people's money would increasingly say the performance is just a tiny part of it. Important, but it's not the complete picture. How you run your organization and what happens within the organization, including behaviors, is as important to us. So that was an encouragement to us, and it meant that we were able to grow our business against massive titans in the
Yes.
asset management business and be different.
Yes.
Have a differentiated product. And you might say, well, what's different about a fund? Well, a fund has to outperform. So you might say, well, any fund can outperform if it's managed well, but it's got to be sustained over a period of time. And you have to have the confidence of the investors that as the markets get choppy, your house or your company will manage that asset well. So I suppose it ran all the way through. So they did look for culture. They looked very carefully at how we ran our board, how we rewarded ourselves, how we rewarded our people, and how we looked after our people. So the stakeholder, yes, ran all the way through the whole gamut of the organization.
Final thing I'd ask you, Ian, you just, as we were coming in, you said it's not about the financial engineer. You and I were just talking.
Sure.
It's about the people. Can you, and I noticed you referenced the people again just a moment ago. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
I suppose I can answer it anecdotally. The reason why I've been able to stand down from the Miton Group after being there since 2011 is that I've recruited a whole range of senior managers and, in fact, across the whole piece, who I think are brighter and more competent than myself.
Yes.
And I've empowered them to run that business and grow that business on behalf of all the stakeholders. And I think people are so important that you have to come to a point where you empower them to carry on and grow that business and be brave enough and courageous enough to say, not wash your hands of your involvement. I still have a stake in the business, an investment in the business, but to allow them to flourish.
Yes.
Without you there.
Yes.
They can always call on you and they can always speak to you. But if you've done your job well, they should be able to flourish. So people are critical. They're critical to the future of any business.
Excellent. Thank you very much, man.
Thank you very much.
All right.